here's video number 2 going over our music fundamental terms. And this time we're going to focus a little more on tonality specifically as a system of music. So we're starting with the idea of an interval. So what does that mean? And it basically refers to the space between two notes. So if we go back to our classic Somewhere Over the Rainbow example, somewhere between each note there's an interval. So, you know, this is not something you need to memorize, but just to tell you, you've got an octave there. And then a half step, and then a third, and then we're going step, step, half step. So those are our terms for, you know, how we talk about the space between the notes. Because otherwise, how could you tell people what you wanted to hear? You know, like, okay, if you say sing an octave above that, the singer will know, okay, I know what you mean. La, la. So it's a useful, you know, talking about intervals is a very sort of practical, useful element of music. So for the purposes of our class, and especially right now, there's really 3 intervals that are important to us. The first is a half step, which on the very first day of class, we already, you know, this is where I would play at the beginning of Jaws, but you all already brought that up and we watched it. The that famous theme of Jaws, the movie with the gigantic shark, is a half step. So the half step is the smallest interval that we use in tonal music. And here are just some examples. And you can, you know, try to sing a note that's in between that. In all sorts of other traditions of music, they can have many notes that are in between those notes. But for this particular tradition, this is the smallest interval that we really grapple with. That's a half step. And then if you put 2 half steps together, you get a whole step. So there's a little mathematical equation in there that makes sense. 2 half steps make a whole step. So here I am, I go down a half step, I go down another half step, and there's my whole step. So here's some other whole steps. And then the other interval that we're really concerned with is the octave. And the octave is special, as we talked about last time, because what it represents is the same pitch. So whereas with a half step or a whole step, those are 2 different pitches. Like if I play them at the same time, you can hear how close together they are. They're really 2 different notes. Whereas the octave has a very open, clear sensibility because it's the same, it is what we call the same pitch. It's just that it's higher or lower by twice the amount. So this high B flat is twice the frequency of the lower B flat. So you can have an octave on absolutely any pitch. You know, pick any note you could sing, you can, you know, sing an octave above or below it. What you're doing is doubling the frequency. Obviously, we're not really aware of that as we're doing it. But that is what's happening, and it has that sort of arcing, clear quality. Like you can't really imagine, you know, the Somewhere Over the Rainbow song. Ooh, that doesn't have, you know, that sounds very dissonant, whereas somewhere, there's the rainbow. So those are the main intervals that we're going to deal with to start. And basically, to vastly oversimplify things, but hopefully, clarify them in a useful way for now, what happened with tonal music was, we had this octave. And the question is, how do we, what comes in between the octave? How do we fill in that space? And, there's an infinite number of ways you could fill that space, the notes that you could sing in between these two. But what ended up happening in history is that this space became filled by something that we call the major scale. And it sounds like this. And that might sound familiar. If you've ever seen, The Sound of Music, do a dear, female dear, that is a song that is teaching this major scale. So, and we can think about the major scale as being made up of whole steps and half steps. So, the sort of formula for it is whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. So that you can start on any note, and if you follow that formula, it's kind of like an algorithm, then you can create a major scale. So if I start on this note, I'm going a whole step, a whole step, a half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step, and then created a major scale. So basically, what happened with the tonal system was that composers just started experimenting. Let's see, if we base all our music on this major scale, what kind of music can we create? So it is a sort of core grounding for music, tonal music, as it started in the 1600s and as it continues through today. Now, there is another scale, so we call that the major scale. And there's another scale that became very useful, which we call the minor scale. And that gives us a little more flexibility for expression. And the minor scale, for our purposes, we just need to remember one thing about it, which is that instead of whole, whole, half, we're doing a whole step and then a half step. So that third pitch is a half step lower. That third pitch has a lower sound. And that gives it a bit of a more melancholy feel. So a minor scale used in music, that minor tonality, it's gonna evoke melancholy, sadness. It also can be used for dark and fearsome things. Think of the Darth Vader theme. So, that major scale has a brighter sound. The minor scale has that sort of more somber sound in it. So we're going to talk a lot more about that. But for the time being, that's the sort of basic idea to internalize. And the third scale that we have here is the chromatic scale. And so chromatic, that word means color, chrome. So basically the chromatic scale is the most, it fills up that octave with all half steps. So here's our octave. If I just play half steps, that's the whole algorithm. Just play all the half steps between these two notes. There's your chromatic scale. And so immediately we can note something about these scales, because when you have a major scale or a minor scale, you've got a mix of sounds that creates a kind of hierarchy. So, here's our major scale. Especially at the end there with the half step, it leads us up to feel a strong sense of that tonic, that note that we begin and end on. actually, we hear each of these notes in relation to that tonic. And that's because it's made up of a combination of whole steps and half steps. The same thing goes for the minor scale. We hear it. We hear all the notes of that scale in relation to the tonic. Whereas if you have just 12 half steps, there's really no order in that. All the notes are kind of equal, they're all the same. It has a very sort of homogenizing sound. So, you know, let's just put that in our minds to sort of contemplate, because, you know, if we think of music as sounds that are ordered, then we have to ask, well, what creates that order, and why do we hear that order, and what is the nature of that order? And thinking about the major scale, the minor scale versus the chromatic scale, it's a really different experience of music across that span. So that's useful to think about. The piece you can check out is called Flight of the Bumblebee by Rimsky-Korsakov, and that is very chromatic. And so you can hear sort of what's possible with basically just that chromatic scale. All right. So the last terms I want to get to here are also very critical for our understanding of the tonal system. Chord. Now, a chord technically just means more than 2 notes played at the same time. You know, 2 notes, 3 notes, 5 notes. You know, there doesn't have to be any specific sound. It's just a bunch of notes played together. But as it happens in the tonal system, we create chords based on that major and minor scale. So you know, you're going to hear a lot of music that is, you know, built via chords based on that scale. So we'll clarify that a little more. But you know, you can think about chords as being very different from melody. Like melody is one note after another, whereas chords are, you know, all the notes are played at the same time. So here's Somewhere Over the Rainbow as a chord. You know, listening to great, you know, improvised jazz often has a lot of rich, like terrific chords that are really interesting to listen to. So, you know, I think that's a good way to think about it to start. And then we've got these ideas, the triad, the dominant seventh, modulation, transposition. These are words that we use to talk about different things that happen in tonal music. So I'm not going to give a specific definition for now. We're just going to sort of put them in our minds to clarify later. With the sort of dominant idea being that because the tonal system is based on this scale that has this hierarchy, like chords therefore tell us things, they have meaning. So this particular chord that we keep hearing, that goes to the tonic, that dissonance to consonance, we call that a dominant seventh chord. And it goes to the tonic, and it has this function. It has the function of telling us, oh, things are tense, and then we're back home. So it's often at the end of the piece, because it's cueing our brains to recognize, okay, we're at the end. So, you know, quite often, you know, when any sort of modern pop song that you listen to, you know, if you think about that feeling at the end and how you know why it's over, huge percentage of the time, it's because you've got a dominant and then the tonic at the end. And we have just learned, our brains have just intuited over time that that's the message this music is sending us. So that's our sort of intro to the tonal system. It's okay if it's a little mystifying or a lot mystifying, because we have the whole semester. And, but, you know, think about what you feel mystified by. You will not be the only one mystified by it. Please comment in with the things you're mystified by, and we will talk about them. And so we're gonna, in class, talk about all sorts of different instruments. Those are the next terms on our sheet. We've already covered the sort of acoustical terms that are in the textbook. And then the last little bit here is just on notation. And I'll put, again, a pin in this for now. We can do some specific work with notation. But just to sort of reflect on why it's important, you know, music is this ephemeral thing. It, you know, it just, we create it and then it disappears. So having a system that can be where you can write down music is amazing and huge, because, you know, there are lots of civilizations from the past whose music, you know, we don't know how to reconstruct because there wasn't a way to write it down. And so, as I think I've said, you know, we've talked about, or at least broached the subject of why it is that we teach this particular 1,000-year class of this. You know, can we really say, you know, there's a tradition in Europe that goes for this 1,000 years? You could debate yes, you could debate no. One of the arguments for yes would be that the music notation system has sort of consistently developed throughout time, throughout that 1,000 years. So we began talking about the Middle Ages and how Charlemagne, in an attempt to unify his empire, you know, had his people create a notation system so that they could confirm that everyone was singing, you know, the same things at the same time. That notation system evolved over the course of centuries and is still what we use. And even, I mentioned before, doe, a deer, a female deer, this song from The Sound of Music. One way to sing the major scale is to sing do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. And those syllables help you remember, you know, the relationship between the notes. That's a system that was created around 1000. So it's been around for 1,000 years and we still use it today. So notation is kind of the sort of silent hero of our journey this semester, because, you know, I think was really critical to, first of all, us having a lot of this music from the past. Even pretty much all of it. I mean, recording technology only got created in the past century or so. So, you know, it's worth thinking about, and we'll spend some time looking at different kinds of the notation and talking about, you know, how it is that we can, let's say, capture those sounds in writing. All right, I'll see everyone in class. Thanks for listening.